Well, I think this is probably the only time we're going to be doing something like this, where as we're going through the Gospels on our way to Easter, we're going to stay very close to the lesson from last week. And in fact, next week we're going to stay close to it as well. Because there is just so much that is tied up around the feeding of the 5,000. We had the feeding of the 5,000 last week, and then this week we have the disciples and their trip to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and the events that happen as they are buffeted by the wind and the waves. And then next week we're going to look at the aftermath of Jesus' feeding of the 5,000. We're going to go back to John for that. But today we're going to be in Matthew. And one of the things that is happening in this passage, that all four of the Gospels, I mentioned last week that all four of the Gospels include the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Now, only three of the Gospels include the events that happen immediately after, which is Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee to his disciples. Matthew, Mark, and John all include that. And as I mentioned last week, Luke doesn't, and maybe it's because as a Gentile, Luke didn't quite pick up on the significance, or he had other reasons and other things he was focused on that he wanted to get to. But the connection of this is, as I said last week, it all goes back to the Passover and the Exodus. That the Israelites left Egypt and they walked through the Red Sea. That God blew a wind and caused the water to separate, and they were able to walk through on dry ground. And so that miraculous control over nature and the weather is being picked up again today in this passage. And one of the reasons why we're going to Matthew instead of, we could have read it right out of John, but Matthew includes a unique story about Peter and Peter's response to seeing Jesus on the water. And we really want to look at that. And I've titled today's sermon, Doubtful Faith. And you'll see how that comes through, especially with Peter. What I mean by this, doubtful faith, it's the kind of faith that believes but doubts. And to start off, I'd like to give just an illustration of what I think happens in a lot of our lives sometimes. Back in 1859, there was a tightrope walker named Charles Blondin. And the story goes that he was, and I think this is historically, they've got documentation of this, that he was the first man to walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And apparently he walked across it multiple times over the course of many days. And great crowds were coming out to watch him. At one point, he took a table or like a stove top of some sort, cooked himself an omelet in the middle of the rope, ate the omelet, and then continued his feat. He was doing all of this without any safety nets or any safety rope. Most tightrope walkers today will have a cable that's attached to them behind if they're doing crazy stunts like this, so that if they do fall, they will be caught and saved. At one point, the story goes that Charles Blondin filled a wheelbarrow with 350 pounds of cement and went across the tightrope carrying that wheelbarrow. And after he had done it a couple of times, he asked the crowd, did they think he could take a man across? And everybody was shouting out, yes! Did he believe that he could take a man across? And everybody was saying yes. And one man in particular was quite vocal in his belief that he could take a man across. And so he pointed to the man and said, do you believe I could take a man across? And the gentleman said, yes. At which point the story goes that Charles Blondin said, sir, get in the wheelbarrow. I think that's where a lot of people's faith with Jesus and God is. Do you believe? Yes. Do you believe? Yes, without a doubt. And then God says, get in the wheelbarrow. And we say, wait a minute. We believe that God can do it for somebody else. We trust God for Him to come through for other people. is what it's coming down to. Yeah, I believe you can take a man across. That doesn't mean I'm willing to put my life on the line for it. That doesn't mean I believe you can take me across. And that's what Peter is going to be in a situation, and that's what we're going to be seeing in this passage. And I want to just encourage us to think of our lives. When we proclaim faith in Jesus, are we proclaiming our faith and our trust that, yes, we believe He can do it? Or do we believe in Him to the point where we would be willing to get in the wheelbarrow with Him? That's a tough call. Well, that's what we're going to be looking at in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33 today. It picks up right where we left off. If you'll recall in John gave us the insight that the people were getting ready to take Jesus by force and make Him king. Right? And Jesus didn't want that, so He sent His disciples away, He sent the crowds away, and He went up on a mountain by Himself to pray. And that's exactly what is going to begin happening here. Now, the issues that we're dealing with, real quick, I just want to touch on the geography so that it's in our minds. I said last week that the feeding of the 5,000 maybe happened around a town called Bethsaida, because Luke tells us that Jesus left and went away with His disciples to Bethsaida. And so you can see that right on the top of the Sea of Galilee on the left, or on the right side there, is where Bethsaida was. Now, Mark tells us after the feeding of the 5,000 that Jesus sent His disciples to go to Bethsaida. So possibly what happened is Jesus ended up in somewhere, and Mark actually uses the language to the other side to Bethsaida. And there's a lot of to the other side language. That doesn't mean that they're going straight across, though. Because what happens is in John tells us that he sent the disciples to Capernaum in the boat. And as you can see, Capernaum's there just on the right side, just a little bit away from Bethsaida. But, maybe he was in the region of Bethsaida, but they were in a remote area. That's why the disciples were saying, send the people away so that they can find food. There's nothing here for them to eat. So they're in a remote area, and he's sending his disciples on ahead of him. Now, just to the a little bit southwest of Capernaum there is Gennesaret. And that's where they're going to end up. Okay, so all of the action today happens on the upper part of the Sea of Galilee. And just to put it in your mind of how big of an area we're talking about, the Sea of Galilee today is about 13 miles long and about 8 miles wide. So if you were to take the 820 loop around Fort Worth, you turn the Sea of Galilee on its side, that's roughly east and west loop 820. And then 8 miles, loop, from I-20 to 820 is closer to about 8 to 9 miles. It's a little bit longer than that. It's like 13 miles, tall. And so it would just be a little bit, Sea of Galilee is a little bit narrower than I-20 to 820 there. But that's the area that we're talking about. And so you could walk. I actually mapped it in my preparations. You can walk from Bethsaida to Capernaum in a couple of hours today. That's how small this area is. I think sometimes we look on a map, we think things are bigger. You could walk it in a couple of hours. You could walk from Bethsaida to Gennesaret in about 4 hours. Okay? So maybe as Jesus is sending His disciples on in the boat, the idea is, and in fact, I can't remember which one of the authors says it this way, but he sent them ahead of him. Kind of the idea to go and prepare the next place, and he would be coming after. It's very possible that the disciples, they were okay with that idea because they could go across in the boat. It would only take them about a half an hour to an hour to sail across, and Jesus could follow walking in a few hours, and He would show up later that night is the idea. But anyway, that's just the area and the geography that we're dealing with as we get into this. But let's go ahead and look at Matthew chapter 22, chapter 14, I'm looking at verse 22. Verse 22. We read, immediately, after he had fed everybody, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he sent the crowds away. And while isn't really the greatest translation, until he sent. And so he said, hey, you guys get out of here, go ahead of me to the other side, I'm going to send the crowds away. And until he got them away, then he would follow, is kind of the idea that Matthew is saying there. But then we're told in verse 23, after he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now Luke has Jesus praying often. But Matthew and Mark really only show Jesus praying here and in the Garden of Gethsemane. So it's important to Matthew to point out Jesus went away to pray. Luke has Jesus praying before he assigns the disciples, praying and getting away as often as he can. Matthew and Mark don't show him doing it as much. So Matthew's making a point. He went off to pray by himself. And then when it was evening, he was there alone. Now this evening business, because the whole reason why the disciples wanted to send Jesus to send the crowds away before he fed the 5,000 was because evening was approaching. So the feeding of the 5,000 actually seems to have happened in a rather quick period of time. Because evening was approaching, he fed them, he sent the crowds away, he's gone up on the mountain to pray, and now evening is coming. And now evening is finally here, and he was there alone. And then we were told in verse 24, but the boat was already a long distance, literally many strata. Many strata, like a stadium. Where we get the word stadium is this distance of a strata. John tells us that they had gone about 25 to 30 strata, which would be about 2.8 to 3.5 miles. That's how far out in the lake they were. They were already a long distance from the land, but now we read that they are battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And I know I point it out quite a bit. Just like God taking the Israelites to a place where there was bitter water, and then a place where there was no food, and then he had to provide the manna. Jesus went out to a place where there was no food for the crowd. They were in a desolate area, and that's where he fed the 5,000. Jesus forced his disciples into the boat. Matthew says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat. That is language of compulsion. He forced them into the boat to go away. And you have to ask yourself, was the storm a surprise to Jesus? I have a hard time thinking it was based on what we're going to see him do. Jesus is the one that sent them in the boat. Jesus is the one that put them in the position where now what should have been an easy sailing trip, an easy row across, shouldn't have taken longer than an hour. Now they are being battered by the waves. The wind is contrary to them. And in fact, the very next verse is going to tell us that the fourth watch shows up. The fourth watch would be 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock a.m. So they're going to end up spending the entire night in the middle of a storm trying to get to a place that they could have walked to in a couple of hours, that they should have been able to sail to within an hour. And Jesus is the one that put them in the boat. Jesus is the one that put them out there. And so we've got to just remember that sometimes when we get into little storm situations, when we are being battered, when we are in a place and we're asking ourselves, why are we going through this? Sometimes it's our sin, but without the inclusion of I'm sinful and I'm willful and I'm rebellious and that's how I've gotten here. We can get into those positions because God brought us to those places. He put us in those boats, and he put us in those storms, and he sent us into that. And that's what he has done to these disciples. And he allows us and sometimes guides us into these storms in our lives, these difficulties where we are being battered and bashed by our circumstances and the things around us. And when God sends us into those things, it's not because He hates us, and it's not because He doesn't love us, and it's not because He's rebuking us necessarily. He's doing it to help us grow. He wants us to grow in our faith and in our trust in Him. God desires for us to be confident in Him. Even as we're going in those difficulties, He desires for us to be confident in Him. Now, if you look up the word confidence, it actually there's an idea of self in the word. Self-confident, that we are confident in our abilities. But God wants us to be confident in Him, to trust in Him. And that's His desire for the disciples as He's putting them out there. Now, they are probably working very hard to survive the storm. They might not really be thinking about Jesus. Maybe they're kind of grumbling in their own hearts. Why did Jesus put us in this boat? Why isn't He here with us? Why is He making us go through this? Why are we having to, And if we're honest, we've probably thought a lot of those kind of thoughts in our own lives with our own struggles and difficulties that we have faced. Well, as I said, verse 25 tells us that in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus came to them. He was walking on the sea. So about 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., sometime in that area, Jesus is walking across a stormy sea. In fact, Mark tells us that Jesus is intending to walk right past them. According to Mark, Jesus is not planning to stop or have any interaction with His disciples. He's going to walk to the other side so that He can be there when they get there, maybe. We don't know. Mark just says He's intending to walk by them. But fortunately for the disciples, in verse 26, when the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, so they actually saw Him, they're terrified. They were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." This is the word that we get phantasm from. They say it's a phantasma. It's some kind of an apparition that has come out from the dead. It's the same idea as when Saul goes to the witch of Endor and has her call up Samuel for him. An apparition shows up. He's not physical, but it's not just a voice talking. Some kind of a form shows up for her, and it scares her to death. Same thing's happening here. It's a ghost! And they cried out in fear. They're crying out, and they're afraid. And Jesus, in verse 27, but immediately, so He immediately put them in the boat. As soon as they cry out, immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, that the phrase for "take courage," sometimes it's translated in our English translations as "take heart." But it has the idea, and sometimes it can be translated of "be of good cheer." So, I don't know about you, but "be of good cheer" and "take courage" don't quite track on the same level for me. Like, courage means you're death-defying struggle. Be of good cheer is it's Christmas time. Hey, be happy. And that's why I say that God desires us to be confident in Him. Because the idea of this word can also have to be confident or to be bold. And to be confident or to be bold isn't necessarily have courage. I mean, that word is in there too. But the idea of not being afraid, being confident in what you're doing. Fear doesn't just have to be, like you're afraid of heights or you're afraid of this thing happening. Fear can sometimes just be, I don't think I have what it takes to make this happen. I don't have what it takes to fulfill this. I'm being asked to do something, I think it's beyond my skill set. I can be afraid of looking like a fool. I can be afraid of what others will think. But to have confidence, to be confident means I'm not afraid of falling off the edge because I'm confident I can stay on this side. I am confident I know how to do this. Therefore, I'm not afraid to do it in front of other people. It doesn't necessarily have the same idea of courage, that idea of overcoming our fear, but rather to be confident in our circumstances. And so, in a way, Jesus, what He's telling them is, is not to be afraid that the boat is going to sink, not to be afraid of the wind and the waves and all the storm around them, not to be afraid of him walking up to them, but to be confident that God is going to provide for them, that God is going to take care of them, and that he is watching over them, even in the midst of a storm, to be confident in him. And when Jesus says it is I, it is literally, I am. I am. He is, in a way, communicating to them that he is God. It is him. It's the earliest and closest at this point that Matthew has ever gotten in his gospel to having Jesus declare himself to be God, by using this language of I am. And so he says to them, don't be afraid. And this is a common theme with God and his people, that he doesn't want us to be afraid, not because we're not in danger of being harmed or maybe killed or having bad things happen to us as his people, but because our hope and our trust needs to be in him, not our circumstances. And so that's one of the reasons why in John, with John the Baptist, he can accept that his ministry is ending. He can accept that, when he is sent to be beheaded, he is okay because he's accomplished his goal. He doesn't need to live out a long life. He has got what God has given him. And his ministry needs to end because Jesus' ministry is beginning. When you're there to open up a door, once that other person's walked through the door, your ministry, your work is done. And so John the Baptist understood that. Even though he was under threat, even though he was in prison, his confidence was in God. And similarly for us, his desire would be for us to be confident in him. Now, having said this, in verse 28, Peter responds to Jesus and says to him, Lord, if it is you, which could better be understood since it is you. It's not a calling into question if it is him, but show us that it is, since it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now Jesus was coming to them. Now Peter says, command me to come to you. But notice, what does Peter do? He doesn't say, give me the ability. He doesn't say, give me the gift. But command me, give me an order. Tell me to come to you. And we don't know what his motivation is for it. And we don't know what Jesus is thinking about it. All we know is that Peter asks. And in verse 29, he said, come. So Jesus calls him out. Commands him, come to me. And Peter got out of the boat. He literally got down out of the boat. And walked on the water. And came to Jesus. And it would be so great if it ended right there. But unfortunately, there's verse 30. But seeing the wind, he became frightened. What had Jesus just told them in verse 27? Don't be afraid. And just think of, Peter's the one who wanted to get out of the boat. Peter's the one that said, command me to get into the wheelbarrow. And Jesus said, yes, get in the wheelbarrow. Come. And Peter did it. He got down out of the boat and he started walking across the water to Jesus. This would be like if somebody actually got into that man's wheelbarrow and he started going across Niagara Falls with the man in the wheelbarrow. But as he's going across, the roaring of the rapids underneath him starts to make him afraid. And instead of trusting in the one who's taking him across, he starts thinking about and looking at everything else. And I don't know about you, but if you're in the wheelbarrow and you start looking over, that's probably not a good motion for the guy carrying you. And the same is true in Peter's life. He starts seeing the wind. He became frightened and beginning to sink. It wasn't, he didn't just fall immediately. He starts sinking. He cried out, Lord, save me. Now, he had just earlier said, If it is you, command me to come out to you. He's the one that put himself in that position. He's the one that was out there on the water. He had faith. But now his faith is doubting. And he's starting to sink. And he cries out, Lord, save me. And there's that word again, verse 31. Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? Now, this word of doubt is an interesting... James tells us that a person needs to trust in God and not doubt, not waver. And the word James uses is the idea of to be of two minds, to be thinking two different ways, and to be thoroughly like going back and forth in your thoughts. Thoroughly. The word used doubt here is distazo, which means to stand. It's a compound word made from one word to stand and the other word to. So it has the idea to doubt, to waver, or to hesitate. But it's focused on how we stand. And so it's the idea of standing in two different places. It's the idea of if I'm walking this way, but I'm thinking about walking back the other way, what do? I have to move back that way. And so I'm standing here 1 second, and I'm standing here the second, and I'm doubting. But I'm doubting with my body. I'm doubting with my actions and my motion. And that's why he says to them, why did you doubt? Because at some point in his walking, he was no longer walking towards Jesus. He started thinking about the boat. Kind of like the Israelites saying, hey, we'd love to go back to our slavery in Egypt where we at least got to eat next to pots full of meat. Peter is saying, maybe I overdid this. Maybe I don't really want to be out here on the waves with Jesus. Maybe I'd rather be back in the boat with my buddies. Because this is scary where I'm at now. And he starts to doubt. He had already walked, and here's the thing, he had already walked some distance. He was walking toward Jesus. He had proven that Jesus was keeping him up on the water. But then he started thinking about other things, and he started to doubt. And he had little, as Jesus said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you start moving back? Why are you standing in two places? Why aren't you just consistently coming forward? And the truth is that as we walk with Jesus, as we go in this life, this is a good illustration that once we have started, we need to keep moving toward him. This is why Jesus said that nobody who puts their hand to the plow and then looks back is worthy of me. Once we start, we got to keep going. You know, if a person had ever gotten in that wheelbarrow, nobody ever did. But if a person had gotten in that wheelbarrow, once they started going, there's no turning back. You got to trust him for the long haul. And the same is true with our walk with Jesus. Once we've started, we've got to trust him for the long haul. We've got to keep moving toward him. We can't start thinking about how nice it was back in the boat. We just need to keep moving. And the great thing is that whenever this happened, we don't know how far apart they were, but Jesus was close enough or became close enough to immediately catch him. And so a wonderful thing that we see is that even when we doubt, even when we struggle, we cry out, he will make up the difference. He makes up what's lacking. And he picks him up. But the better thing would have been to keep moving toward him. And so that's what God is calling us to do, as we step out in faith, to be confident in him and not to turn back, but to keep going. But unfortunately, a lot of us, a lot of times, and I'm speaking for myself, we have doubtful faith. We're like the father with the son who had a demon that would throw him into the fires, and Jesus' disciples couldn't save the boy, and the father cries out to Jesus, I do believe, help my unbelief. I do believe, but I know I don't believe enough. Help my unbelief. Make up the difference of my unbelief. And one of the interesting things that's going on here, in verse 30 there was, Lord, save me. And then in verse 31, you of little faith. These are a callback to Matthew chapter 8. There was an earlier situation where Jesus and his disciples are in a boat in the middle of a storm. And it's very interesting that this happens twice in the Gospels. But in Matthew chapter 8, in verse 23, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. Now, he hadn't called the 12 to be apostles yet. He didn't even have Matthew with him at this time. He just had the ones that he had brought so far, mostly fishermen. And so they got in the boat with him, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was asleep. And so it was a bad storm, but it wasn't bad enough to make Jesus nervous. And he was asleep. And so in verse 25, they came to him and woke him, saying, Save us, Lord, we are perishing. Lord, save me. Save us, Lord. And in verse 26, he said to them, Why are you afraid, you men of little faith? And what did he just say to Peter? Why are you you of little faith? Why did you doubt? Why are you afraid, men of little faith? And then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. And the men were amazed and said, What kind of man, what manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? And so here's an interesting thing that's going on. There's these parallels. The disciples, not all of them, but enough of them, have already experienced being in a storm and Jesus calming the storm. Now they're in another storm, and now they're seeing an apparition walking across the water, and Peter is out there now, and so the same language, save me, you of little faith. But notice that the disciples, when Jesus calmed the storm, their question was, what kind of a man is this, that the wind and the waves obey him? And that was in chapter 8, and now here we are in chapter 14. And what we're seeing is that as God goes through, a lot of times in the Bible, Jesus has to repeat things. He tells the disciples, I'm going to be handed over to the Gentiles, and I will be killed, and 3 days later I will rise again. He has to tell them that multiple times because they don't pick up on it the first time. And the same is true for us. A lot of times we need things repeated to us several times before we actually grasp it, and it really becomes a part of our lives. And the same is true here, that this experience of Jesus calming the storm is being repeated in a way to help it sink into the disciples. He does a similar thing he fed the 5,000. A little bit later on, he'll feed 4,000 people. He really wants them to get that, and that's why it's repeated. And so this is being repeated in a way because God is giving us opportunities to grow in our knowledge of him. They were in the boat, it was being swamped, Jesus fixed it. Now they're in a boat and Jesus isn't with them. So it's a new scenario, but Jesus is showing up to them. But they're getting the opportunity to grow. And I would say Peter's grown quite a bit. He went from being terrified and waking Jesus up to getting out of the boat. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to take it all the way. But God does the same thing in our lives. He is giving us opportunities to grow in our knowledge of him. One of the reasons why we find ourselves in those storms of our lives, those struggles, is that we might grow in him and in what we understand of him and how we know him. That we would become more intimate with him. And this is what's happening for them. After Jesus has got Peter, verse 32, when they got into the boat, literally when they got up into the boat, they had to get up into it, the wind stopped. And those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, You are certainly God's Son. They went from chapter 8, what kind of a man is this, that the wind and the waves obey him, Now they worship him. And they say, you are certainly God's Son. It is true and certain that this is what has happened. And then after that, they find themselves in Gennesaret, is what Matthew tells us. There's an interesting thing, though. Mark has a less sunshiny view of the disciples. Mark tells us that when all this happened, Mark leaves out Matthew's story about Peter. So just Jesus, when they see him, he tells them, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. And then in verse 51, then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. For they had not gained any insight of the loaves, from the incident of the loaves. But their heart was hardened. Matthew says they worshiped, and they said, you are certainly the Son of God. Mark says they were utterly astonished. They had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. And because of the way that they both write, both authors can be true. They worshiped, but they hadn't really gained any insight. In fact, later on, when they have after Jesus feeds the 4,000, they get in a boat and they have no bread. And Jesus starts talking to them about the leaven of the Pharisees, and all the disciples can think of is, oh man, he's upset with us because we didn't bring any bread. And Jesus actually calls them out on it. He says, have you learned nothing from the feeding of the 5,000 or the feeding of the 4,000? Why are your hearts so hard? So Jesus has the same response later on that Mark shares with us, that their hearts are hardened because they're not quite grasping it. Here Jesus is. He's fed the 5,000, showing this miraculous ability. Now he's calmed the storm, reasserting who he is. And they worship, but they doubt. They're astonished, they're amazed, but they don't know what to do with it. They have that doubtful faith. And they're going to wrestle with that until Jesus Christ rises from the dead. And maybe you and I, we struggle with it ourselves. We believe, but we struggle to believe. We've seen God do amazing things, and we believe he'll do it. We're not quite sure he's going to do it for us. We're not quite sure we want to get out there in those waves with him. We're not quite sure we're willing to be in the wheelbarrow, even though we believe he can take it across. The answer to that doubtful faith is to have confidence in God, to trust that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. And not to turn back from that, but to keep going. And as we keep going, he's going to keep taking us through opportunities to grow in our knowledge of him. And that is the way to move on from that doubtful faith. Everybody starts out with doubtful faith. And a lot of those failures, Peter failed quite a bit. He failed here to keep focusing on Jesus. Later on, he denies Jesus. Peter failed quite a few times. But the time came when Peter didn't fail. The time came when Peter stood up and proclaimed Jesus on Pentecost, and thousands believed. That doubtful faith at the beginning, when we allow God to take us through those experiences, when we increase our confidence and our trust and our faith in him, when we keep going with him, over time, that doubtful faith disappears and becomes true and solid faith. So take comfort. If you recognize in your heart, yeah, I believe, but keep walking. Keep walking with him. And someday that but will go away. And you'll believe and you'll act on that belief. Let's keep walking with him. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the fact that you don't give up on us, that you don't stop after we fail the first time or the 6th time or the 20th time, but you keep reaching out to us and picking us up. You keep giving us opportunities to grow in our knowledge of you and our trust in you and our confidence in you, Lord. And we pray, Father, for ourselves that we would keep on coming to you, that we would keep following you and seeking you, even as we face these trials. Lord, may we keep walking your direction. We ask and pray this today in Jesus' name. Amen.